Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm excited to bring you part 2 of my interview with Shannon. Shannon is a therapist, author, coach, and the creator behind the YouTube channel Therapist Talks, Thrive Beyond Narcissism. She specializes in helping people navigate and heal from narcissistic, abusive, and toxic relationships. What I'm about to play for you is part 2 of our discussion on navigating a relationship with an adult child who may be exhibiting narcissistic characteristics. I strongly encourage you to check out part 1. If you tuned into part 1, you'll remember we explored some key topics, including the signs and patterns parents should watch out for when trying to identify or recognize narcissistic characteristics. Then we looked at the origins of this relationship dynamic, both interpersonally and intrapsychically. In other words, what drives the intense conflict that occurs sometimes in the parent-child relationship. So finally, we ended off talking about boundaries, and we stopped there because Shannon had a lot to say, and we wanted to push it to part 2. So I'm going to bring that in now. Without further ado, let's go back into my conversation with Shannon, and we'll pick up right at the point where we're going a little bit further into boundaries, and we're looking at it from different perspectives, from Shannon's perspective and from more of a psychodynamic perspective. I hope you find this conversation both insightful and informative. Hello, Shannon. Welcome back. And again, I want to express my appreciation for you joining us and taking time out of your busy day again to continue this conversation, this very complicated conversation on living with a child who may have an adult child who may have narcissistic characteristics. So for everybody who's listening, this is part 2. In part 1, Shannon and I were basically we started by describing some of these characteristics or tendencies. And we were talking about what one could do, a parent can do, when trying to figure out how to relate to an adult child like this in your life. But we stopped, we ran out of time, and we agreed that we would continue this in part 2. We stopped right at boundaries and what I was calling containment. And we said we would do a little deeper dive into that because Shannon was beginning to say that boundaries are very complicated. And oftentimes she hears on her own channel that they don't work. And she seemed to have some strong feelings about it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Shannon, and describe, you started to say they do work, they always work, when applied appropriately. So maybe we could kick it off and jump in from there. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay.
And thanks so much for having me again. It's really an exciting conversation. Boundaries are, so if we back all the way up to defining them more clearly, we have to understand ourselves. We have to have a better relationship within ourselves. It's another piece of what I do in my work in coaching and my book and my channel. We have to not have a toxic relationship with ourselves. So I have to know that I am being honoring of my own thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs in order to set boundaries. Because if I don't know those things and I don't take care of those things in every relationship, I'm setting those poor boundary relationships in motion from the get-go. And especially we as women tend to be super placaters and people pleasers. And we can set those relationships in motion in really unhealthy ways. And so we have to back up to what do I think, feel, want, and need in this relationship with my adult child, son or daughter.
Let me jump in quickly, just as a quick review. So in part 1, and then just sort of to set the stage, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, so what you're saying is even before boundaries can be implemented, the first step is, remember you gave a scale earlier, like a 1 to 10 scale? With the 5 and above being more what I think we both said is more like a dysregulated state of mind,
right?
What we could call a literal mode of interaction, maybe more yelling or demanding. So in order to set an appropriate boundaries, is it safe for me to say that you have to be in the 1 to 5 level of regulation. So you're setting a boundary already in sort of a clear state of mind. Does that sound right?
Yeah, for sure. You yourself have to be in a calmer state of mind. But even before entering into that relationship or coming back into this relationship, when people seek help, we work first on what is your relationship within your own self? Because we talk to ourselves, 70,000 times a day. And if we're constantly degrading and beating up on and being toxic towards ourselves, how are we then going to stand up for ourselves in any relationship, whether it's, your boss or your friend or your sibling, if you don't, stand up for your thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs, you just...
Yeah, that makes so much sense, because it would fit right in perfectly. If someone is being abusive towards you, even though on the surface you could say, I don't deserve this kind of relationship, but you stay in it or it keeps happening. Yeah, it fits like a glove, because these are already persecutory thoughts that are in your mind. So either they're coming from somebody else or they're coming from you. But the most important thing is they're always there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have to look at that first and then start to understand, what do I want in this relationship and how do I express myself in this relationship and set boundaries in that relationship. And so when we can sort that out for ourselves, then in a 1 to 5 mode, we need to express those things. And the reason boundaries always work is because when we are clear with how we want to be treated in a relationship, the other person has a choice. Like, they can accept that, they can disrespect that, they can blow up about it, they can melt down about it. And then the boundary setter can have that information. So if I'm trying to work this out with my adult child who's still living with me and they're 30 years old or whatever, we're making up on this, or they are, we're in relationship just by phone calls periodically to see the grandkids or something like that. If that is a toxic interaction, we can say, hey, I'm not going to keep playing my part in this toxic interaction. It needs to change. I'm willing to do A, B, and C. I'm not willing to listen to you when you're cussing at me, when you're being explosive. So when that happens, I'm going to hang up the phone. I'm going to leave the house. I'm going to disengage for a while. So you're presenting the boundary, right? And then the other person can say, okay, well, that makes sense. I will honor that boundary. Or, no, you're always trying to control me. Forget it. I can do what I want. They're just spinning out. That gives that person the information they need. Okay, I don't get to exist in this relationship, apparently. This person has become so toxic to me that when I try to just simply exist in this relationship with my thoughts and feelings, they lose their mind. Well, that's clear. I don't get to exist in this relationship. And so what I've seen happen is when it is a parent and adult child, is that when that dynamic happens, if the parent can stay in their own truth and stay in their own strength, but not blow up and engage with them, oftentimes the adult child kind of comes around. And it might not happen for a day, a week, a month, a year, but eventually they recognize that my parent is being reasonable. I'm not. And I want to be back in relationship. And then they come around to accepting those boundaries.
That's interesting. So just for the listeners again, when I spoke earlier about the act of containment, it's so different than what you're describing, Shannon. And that's why I'm so interested in the way you describe boundaries, because the work that I'm always aiming to do is get people together, So I use this metaphor, and I think it's pretty close to what you're describing, which is the hot potato, right? And you may have heard this before, but if your adult child hands you a hot potato, right, and they kind of shove it on you, which is like what we call projection, what do you do with that? So then you have to make a choice. Like, do I shove it back? Do I hold it? Do I throw it away? Do I walk away? So the work that I do typically is if the parent is in a position to consider this, is to hold the hot potato, to cool it down, and then give it back to the child in a way that's more digestible. In other words, in a way that they can actually take it in, they can eat it, which is what we call internalization in my field. So the work then is very different, right, Shannon, than what you're describing. And I appreciate, that's why I'm so happy we're doing this deeper dive into boundaries, because I'm trying to understand, because I hear this too. You mentioned it earlier, like sometimes people say boundaries don't work. And I hear that as well. Like I do create a boundary, but it doesn't work. They keep coming at me. And what I try to do then is to help them, if they are the parent is in a regulated state of mind and able to do this, that's the 1 to 5, by the way, to then help the child. And I know in part 1, you said it's not really their responsibility. And I agree with you. It's not their responsibility. But many people who are in these relationships, it's even if we expand it, with a loved one in a marriage, or even a child with their parent who they don't want to lose, or at least they want to know they've done the most they could. Like, have I done as much as I can before I create this boundary or walk away? Or I forgot, there's a common phrase for this. Oh, go no contact. Now, someone used that word with me just the other day. Their adult child went no contact and the parent is devastated. Yeah. So can you hold the potato, digest, cool it down, and then give it back, which goes back to what you and I just said earlier, which is then using verbal language, helping your child get into a more regulated state of mind so that then you can begin to connect and work on whatever the problem is together in a more collaborative way. So I'm curious, Shannon, what's your reaction to that, if you have one?
Well, it's really interesting. And, the no contact thing is really become weaponized. And it's so common, there's so much sort of self-help on TikTok and YouTube, but not professionals, people who have just been there, done that, and then spout off about it. And it's really sad to me that, that adult children are going no contact, that parents are going no contact.
Yes.
And that to me is a failure to take care of yourself, set boundaries, and stick to your boundaries in a regulated state, and then see what happens. Because I think most of these relationships can be salvaged if we do the right work with the people, with both parties, but even sometimes unilaterally. If you do the work with one part of the couple, of the dyad, oftentimes it can be salvaged because of the work that you're doing. And so, I think
that's right. Because if you could help someone get into a more regulated state of mind, so there's that space that we described earlier, then they are in a much better position to help their child, you see. And that's sort of the goal, or that's what I'm always looking for, because we have to be honest. So many of us become dysregulated in our everyday lives, and it feels just more genuine or nicer to me to know that when I become dysregulated, that there would be a parent there, who can help me get into this more regular. Now, that doesn't mean, maybe this might be a good place for us to transition a little bit, right? Because we also wanted to talk about the emotional impact that this has on the adult, right? And the reason I thought about that question is I was just about to say, this does not mean that the adult becomes an emotional punching bag. Back to that example you used earlier with it gets so intense that the sheriff has to arrive. Right. That's a very different story. Maybe that's more common in your practice. I don't see that as much, but I'm sure it's there.
It's pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. But what I'm talking about is more that emotional abuse, and then being able to not to absorb emotional abuse like a punching bag, but only if you could take it in and digest it and cool it down like the potato, because then it's not having a devastating impact on you because you're still 1 through 5, not 5 through 10, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So to jump back to your analogy, I think that, and that dovetails beautifully, because my initial reaction to the potato is, well, the parents are going to get burned if they hold on to that potato and try to cool it down. But if they had oven mitts on, then they can hold the potato and cool it down. And I think the oven mitts would be that I emotionally protect myself, that I don't take this on as mine, that I don't engage in it, I don't try to argue it, I don't try to hold it and try to, grab onto it and hold it like that. I have oven mitts and I protect myself. I even use the analogy of the Star Trek shields, with the Klingons attacking, they would put up their Star Trek shields and the attacks would bounce off. And when we truly are in our healthier selves and we truly are taking better emotional care of ourselves, we can put up shields in a toxic environment and just kind of go, wow, oh, wow, they went there. Oh, wow, they took that approach, and that's the self-care style of coping with that, or the oven mitts with the potato. You can just go, oh, wow, look at that, but not take it in and take it on.
Listen, I love that you played with my metaphor. So let me keep going with it just for fun, okay?
Okay.
So with the mitts, if you put on the mitts, you're still holding the potato. And that's a little different in my mind, at least, but please clarify it if I'm misunderstanding. That's different than the shield, you see, because the shield, it bounces off, right? But with the mitts, you're actually taking it in. You're holding something for them that they can't bear to hold, which is a little different than just putting it off. And I think that's an important distinction, because if the child experiences you as holding the potato, now you're modeling something. You see, you're saying, look, this thing is hot, but it's not so hot that it's going to destroy me, and nor will it destroy you. And together we can hold this if we work in a collaborative way.
Right.
Whereas the shield, you're saying, I can't be touched. This thing is too dangerous. Whatever's going on and you're shooting at me is so dangerous, it has to be repelled rather than taken in.
That's true. And it has to be, in each of these relationships are different levels and intensities. And I use the example of the sheriff to point out that even at that 10 level of rage and unreasonableness and absolute acting out, the person was able to calm down immediately when the sheriff arrived, was able to ramp right back up to 10 as soon as the sheriff left. That is a really important thing to recognize, because we are often, in our enabling behavior as parents, often don't give an adult child the recognition for the strengths they do have, the abilities they do have. And that's why sometimes in that holding the potato and taking in all their garbage without the oven mitts, we are enabling. We are also teaching that kid, I think you can't handle this. I think you can't regulate yourself. I don't believe in you to actually mature or grow up or be a grown adult. So we're giving them the wrong message when we enable, and we give the right message when we feed it back to them and say, here, hold this potato and then bring it to me when it's cooled off.
Let's think about the enabling for a moment, if we could sort of hover over that. What might be an example? Because I'm thinking of enabling as well, but I'm thinking in terms of different narcissistic characteristics. You have the grandiose narcissist, the demanding, loud, like kind of a little closer to what you described earlier with the sheriff arriving, although that's more like a malignant narcissist, who's completely out of control and very sadistic, right? Yeah. But then you also have all the way on the other end of the continuum, although these characteristics are part of every type of all narcissism, but the vulnerable narcissist. So I'm trying to think of what is enabling, like what's an example of that? Because I could see it clearly with the vulnerable narcissist, because they come home, they present as very needy and clingy and demanding, and they can't think for themselves and they need a lot of assistance, kind of like, think for me, I'm not capable of doing this.
Right.
So enabling in that case is actually functioning for them rather than helping them figure out, like sort of helping them develop the intrinsic motivation to function independently. Exactly. You're functioning for them. And that's a problem, by the way, because we were going to just talk about, I know we're all over the place right now, but we were going to talk about the psychological impact it has on the parent. And that's part of the dynamic, is if you are enabling them. Oh, so maybe there is a link. If you're enabling them, you're in it with them. Right. And the psychological impact, while on the surface may seem quite devastating. Oh, it's so difficult to always take care of my adult child. But on the other hand, there's immense level of gratification, maybe unconsciously, that goes along with that, because one gets a good feeling, maybe, look at how much my child still needs me. Look at how important I am. They can't even leave home and function on their own. Good thing I'm here for them.
Yeah.
But that's an example of enabling. But I did start with a question for you and all that, Shannon. And then
somewhere in there.
Which is, how are you thinking about enabling? That's where it started. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so enabling is doing for somebody what they can do for themselves and should do for themselves. And again, this starts long time ago in the early years. If we see ourselves as the people that are supposed to raise these people to be good adults versus if I need my kid to need me. And
Yes.
So those are two very different paradigms. And I did a lot of work in the addiction field with, late teens in addiction and family work in that field. And the enabling was so profound. Sometimes, parents were literally doing the kids' homework, writing their essays, doing everything for them, doing their laundry when they're perfectly capable of doing their laundry, and doing all the cooking and cleaning when the kid never helped. So that kind of thing. And I use the analogy of, if you're so scared that you don't want your kid to ever bump its head and you carry it rather than let it learn to walk, you're actually handicapping your child because their leg muscles and bones are not going to develop appropriately, and they're going to be forever disabled by your love. And I understand it's from love, but it's not good for your child. It's literally emotionally disabling them, to not let them feel frustrated, not let them struggle, not let them sometimes even fail. If a kid never gets the chance to see what they can do, then they never grow a sense of self. They are empty inside.
Yes. Yeah, that's a wonderful analogy. I really appreciate it. I would just play around, like, since you've opened this door for us, I would play around with the word love, because I would argue that's not really love. I think in our society, that's what we call love, or we trick ourselves to think is love.
Yeah.
Maybe we could call it self-love, if anything, because all of that enabling that you just described is more for the parent than for the child. But again, disguised to look like doing the homework or whatever it may be is really for the child. Of course, I have to help with that so they could get good grades and they could be very successful. But to your point, it's never allowing them to develop their own sense of autonomy or their own sense of self. So where does that leave them then? Always connected and bound to you, which in essence means it's for you. It's for the parent, not for them.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about the different types of narcissism, and there is sort of that overt, the bully, the rager, and then there's also sort of the imploder. Some people call it the covert narcissist, who could be more manipulative, more needy, more implosive. And when they don't get their way, they tend to go into the, that sort of complete helpless, hopeless, despairing. And then the, parents want to come in and rush in and rescue because they're so scared. And sometimes they even pull the I'm going to kill myself card, which I don't mean to minimize that. Sometimes it's genuine despair and suicidal feelings, but sometimes that's manipulative as well. And again, we have to help a parent learn to look at their child's strengths and encourage, take the child from where they are and build on their strengths so that they can get to where they need to be, instead of just rushing in, rescuing, and not allowing them to struggle towards any kind of functionality.
Yes. And I would just add one thing to that. You have to look at the child's strengths. And this is why this stuff gets complicated. You have to also look at, what is the child actually trying to communicate that they can't do it? In other words, they don't have the words, or for whatever reason don't have the capacity, or they cannot allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to, express a genuine need or an emotion. It comes out more as a demand or a manipulation, as the word that you used a moment ago. So I would say you have to look at that too. If, again, you're in that state and you have the interest in really trying to understand the child. So you want to look at, what are they capable of doing, their strengths, like you said, but also what are they really trying to communicate? And am I missing something here? Especially if you had a parent like we were just describing, who for many years enabled the child. And now the child in later life is rebelling because they don't have a sense of freedom and they don't know how to get a sense of freedom. So the way they do it is through defiance. And then the parent's like, oh, you're being defiant, but you have to really look at, what are they trying to communicate? And back to the way beginning where you and I started, am I not intentionally contributing to this dynamic or this thing that's even going on inside my child?
Right.
So there's a lot to look at here. Yeah. That's why it gets so complicated.
And a lot of times what I find is a parent will say, they're acting just like my ex-spouse. So there's a dynamic of trauma that's really important to look at, but not looking at it as, oh, my poor child, now I've got to take care of them for the rest of their lives, because that's just feeding their incapability.
Yeah.
But just looking at it as, compassionately, lovingly helping
Yes.
them grow and
Yes.
pushing them to grow. Sometimes they've watched this dynamic of the powerful one and you being the passive one and being the bullied one. And so they've become the bully, either overtly or covertly, because that's the dynamic they saw. And that's really important
Who's
too.
in that example? Who becomes the bully there?
So the adult child becomes the bully like their bullying parent, and the vulnerable parent is in the middle. So they got bullied by their spouse, divorced that person now.
Yes.
Then their adult child comes and does the bullying just like their other parent.
I understand. So Shannon, very subtle here and not popular. But what I heard in that little description, that little vignette like that you gave is, it's actually the parent who is the bully. And it's so disguised, it goes under the cover. You don't even see it. How is the parent the bully? The parent is the bully by saying something like, they're acting just like my ex-husband or right? That's not a nice thing to say or to think about your child, because obviously it's an ex for a reason. You don't have such positive feelings. Right. Now, it's not bullying in the traditional sense. I understand, but it's still not a pleasant thought to think that my mom thinks of me like I'm behaving like the person that she left, right, that she doesn't love anymore.
That's right. Yeah, and that just saying that is not helpful or productive, but it speaks to that parent's frozenness in the midst of this.
Yes.
Because they had this bullying impact from their ex-spouse, and it can be male or female. I'm not ever going to say that women don't bully, but they could have had this experience, and now they're experiencing it from their child, and they're frozen and they're incapable until they get help with one of us and somebody else in order to address that and not keep repeating the same dynamic or keep saying, oh, you're just like your father, or you're just like your mother, but actually like, hey, and sometimes I'll even encourage them to say, hey, I apologize for the dynamic you watched growing up. It wasn't healthy. What happened between your father and I or your mother and I was not healthy. And we're going to do this differently. And I noticed you kind of treating me in some ways that are not respectful. And in some ways you saw that was okay with me, which it absolutely is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would add just one more thing to that. And you're treating me, sometimes you treat me in a way that's disrespectful. And I wonder, and that's not okay. I get that part, Shannon, but I would add, and I wonder, what's going on when you do that? Is there something that you're picking up on from me? Maybe I'm doing something to instigate it that I don't even realize. Now, that's not very popular now because it's like, oh, you're blaming the victim. But I want to go back to the beginning of our conversation where we said these things are complicated and things happen in ways that are not always at the conscious level. And a perfect example of that is what you just said. My son behaves like my ex. That's difficult for a child to hear, even an adult child, anybody to hear. So this could be said in a genuine way, like, hey, maybe there's really something for me to learn here. Maybe there is a way I'm communicating or talking to you that I'm not even aware of. Oh, that would be amazing, because now you could have two people actually talking about what's going on between them, rather than the son is just being abusive, which he may be, but I'm just adding another layer to it.
Right. And in fact, when in that example, a mom takes her space and owns her identity really, and her wholeness in that relationship with her son, he's got to treat her differently because the dynamic has shifted. And that's really, really important. I mean, kids pick stuff up so early. My first job out of college was in a domestic violence shelter. And I'll never forget, a little 3-year-old boy and his mom were interacting in the shelter kitchen. And he said, I want ice cream. And she said, it's almost dinner time. And he said, you effing bee. And he punched her in the leg. I mean, he was only thigh high on her or knee high on her, and he punched her and used the words that his father had spoken. He was 3. So these things are indoctrinated very early. And, and that mom had to learn how to parent her child because in that moment, she was just frozen. She didn't address it. So, fast forward 18 years, that guy is not a nice guy to be around.
Yeah, I mean, he took in what we call a malignant introject, right? That's like living inside of him now,
Right.
and then it gets played out in his relationships. Look, Shannon, I love talking to you about this stuff. But again, we're at that point, unfortunately, where we have to start wrapping it up. What did we miss? Because maybe at some point you and I could get together again and continue this conversation, which I find to be so stimulating, actually. I love like talking back and forth about these really complicated matters. So what did we get everything, or was there something lingering? I'll give you the last word, okay?
Wow. Okay. No, and thank you so much for having me. And I do find this really exciting and interesting too, because there's so much to be said. And so often we just kind of skate over the surface because we don't have the time to do that deep dive. So I appreciate you wanting to do that.
Great. Well, very enriching. And thank you again. A very big thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I look forward to doing more of this in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks, Anthony.
Okay. Bye for now, Shannon. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.